The man who just saved dozens of lives inside the mall was the first person the police decided to arrest. Sirens were still echoing through the wide glass corridors of Rivergate Mall when shoppers slowly stepped out from behind counters and display racks, their hands shaking, their voices whispering the same sentence over and over again as if they were trying to convince themselves it was real. Someone stopped him. Someone actually stopped him. And at the center of that growing circle of stunned witnesses stood a tall black man in a gray jacket, with steady breathing and calm eyes, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the chaos around him, as if he had walked through moments like this before, as if panic simply didn't belong to him. And just a few feet away, a young mother clutched her child tightly, while pointing toward him with trembling fingers, saying, "That's him, that's the man who saved us." But before anyone could step closer to thank him, the sound of heavy boots cut across the polished tile floor, and Officer Daniel Reeves pushed through the crowd, with authority already written across his face, his hand raised, his voice sharp. "You right there, don't move." And the entire hallway seemed to freeze again, because nobody expected what happened next. The officer didn't ask questions, didn't thank him, didn't even look at the people he had helped. Instead, he stepped forward and reached for the man's wrists like he had already made up his mind about everything. Phones lifted instantly. Whispers turned louder. "Wait, that's the guy who stopped the shooter," someone said. From behind a clothing rack, another voice followed. He helped everyone get out. But Reeves didn't slow down and didn't listen and didn't change direction as the metal cuffs clicked into place around the man's wrists with a final sound that echoed louder than it should have in a hallway that was supposed to be safe again by now. The man didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at the officer with the same calm expression he had worn moments earlier and said. Quietly, the situation was contained, and something about the way he said it made a security guard nearby glance up with confusion, because that wasn't the way civilians usually talked after something like this, especially not civilians who had just stepped into danger while everyone else ran away. A teenage employee still wearing her name badge whispered to her friend. He moved like he already knew what to do before anyone else did. And that whisper spread faster than anyone expected, because suddenly people started noticing things they hadn't seen before. The man's steady stance, the controlled way he scanned the hallway, the complete absence of fear in his voice. Even Officer Reeves seemed to pause for half a second, as if something about the moment didn't feel normal anymore. But instead of stepping back, he tightened his grip and said, "You can explain yourself downtown." And that was when a small boy pushed through the crowd holding his mother's hand and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "He saved my mom, why are you arresting him?" And for the first time, Officer Reeves hesitated just long enough for the question to hang in the air unanswered, while the man in cuffs simply stood there watching everything unfold as if he were waiting for something else entirely to happen next. Officer Daniel Reeves did not answer the boy's question, and that silence spread faster than any explanation could have, because the people standing in that hallway had just watched something impossible happen, and now they were watching something even harder to understand. The man who had stepped forward when everyone else stepped back was being led away as if he had done something wrong. And the quiet disbelief began turning into something louder as phones kept recording and voices started rising around them. "He helped us," someone said again from the crowd. "He stopped him before anyone else even knew what was happening," another added. But Reeves kept walking as if none of it mattered, guiding the man forward with the same firm grip and the same rigid confidence. And what made the moment stranger was not the arrest itself, but the way the man being arrested did not resist it at all. He did not argue, did not explain, did not even try to show the officer what several witnesses were already saying out loud. Instead, he moved calmly beside him like someone who understood exactly where this situation was going even before anyone else did. And that calmness began to unsettle people more than panic ever could have, because it did not match what they expected. From someone in handcuffs after saving a crowded building full of strangers, a security guard finally stepped closer and said, "Officer, I saw him take control of the situation before we even called it in." But Reeves barely turned his head and answered, "Security does not make arrests here, I do." And that sentence hung heavily in the air because it was not really an answer at all. It was a decision. And decisions like that tend to make crowds uneasy when they happen too fast, especially when they happen in front of witnesses who know what they saw. The young mother who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, still holding her child close, and said, "Please, you do not understand. He told us exactly where to move, and where to stay safe. He knew what he was doing. And for the first time, the officer stopped walking long enough to look directly at the man beside him, as if measuring him again from a different angle. But instead of asking questions, he tightened his tone and said that will be sorted out later. And something about the way he said later made several people exchange looks, because later meant downtown, and downtown meant paperwork and statements and long hours before anyone listened carefully to what had already happened here. The man in cuffs finally spoke again, but only briefly, and only once, saying the threat was neutralized before responders entered the building. And the choice of those words made the security guard blink in confusion, because civilians did not usually talk like that after something like this, especially not with that level of certainty. And yet the officer ignored the sentence completely, as if it did not exist, and continued guiding him toward the exit doors, where flashing lights reflected across the glass walls outside. And as they reached the entrance, another voice from the crowd called out, "Why did he not run when everyone else did?" And nobody answered that question either, because the truth was nobody there actually knew the answer yet. Except perhaps the man walking quietly between two officers without fear and without explanation, and without showing the identification card that everyone watching expected him to have already reached for by now. And as they stepped out into the parking lot, where patrol vehicles waited with engines running, he finally looked once over his shoulder toward the hallway he had just helped clear, and then said something so quietly that only the nearest officer heard it. "I already called someone who needs to know what happened here." And the officer stopped walking for a fraction of a second, because that sentence did not sound like something an ordinary witness would ever say. Officer Daniel Reeves did not respond to what the man said about calling someone who needed to know, because in his mind there was nothing unusual about the situation yet. Nothing that required hesitation or second thoughts. At least that was what he told himself as he guided him across the parking lot toward the patrol vehicle, with red and blue reflections sliding across the pavement like restless shadows. But the closer they moved toward the cruiser, the more people from the mall entrance gathered near the glass doors behind them, watching in silence that felt heavier than shouting ever could have been. And several witnesses were still recording, while quietly repeating what they had seen inside, as if they were afraid the story might disappear if they stopped saying it out loud. "He told us where to stand," someone said again. "He knew exactly where to move," another voice added. And one older man wearing a store manager badge stepped forward far enough that Reeves had to notice him and said, "Officer, I watched the entire thing on the security monitors. This man did not act like someone guessing what to do. He acted like someone trained to do it." And that word "trained" lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, because it did not belong in a normal conversation about a civilian standing inside a shopping mall hallway only minutes earlier. But Reeves answered without slowing down, saying, "Everyone thinks they are trained after something like this until we sort out the facts." And the answer sounded rehearsed even to himself as he opened the back door of the patrol vehicle and gestured for the man to sit inside. Yet instead of hesitation, the man simply lowered himself calmly into the seat, with the same steady expression he had worn from the beginning, as if the patrol car were only another step in a sequence he had already anticipated long before anyone else realized what was happening. And as the door closed, one of the younger officers standing nearby leaned closer to Reeves and said quietly, "Something about him does not feel right. Not dangerous, but different." And Reeves responded with a short glance that said the conversation was over before it began, even though the younger officer could not explain why he felt that way in the first place. Because the difference he sensed was not fear or resistance or confusion, but control. The kind of control people only develop after years of doing something most civilians never experience even once. And inside the vehicle, the man rested his hands calmly in his lap, looking straight ahead at the windshield while the parking lot lights reflected across the glass. And for the first time, Reeves noticed something else he had missed earlier: a narrow, faded scar crossing the man's wrist just below the cuff line. The kind of mark that did not come from ordinary accidents, but from equipment or training environments most people never encountered in daily life. And before Reeves could decide whether that detail meant anything at all, the radio on his shoulder crackled with a dispatcher's voice asking for confirmation about witness statements already coming in from multiple callers describing the same unknown civilian who had taken control of the situation before responders arrived. And that phrasing, "unknown civilian," sounded strange even through the static, because it suggested there was already uncertainty about who he actually was. And Reeves answered quickly, confirming transport in progress. But leaving out the part about the phone call the man had mentioned only moments earlier, because something about that detail did not fit inside the routine report he expected to write later that evening. And as he closed the passenger side door and walked around the vehicle, he heard another officer near the entrance say the same sentence twice, as if repeating it helped make sense of it. He moved like he already knew what was coming before anyone else did. And Reeves paused for half a second before getting behind the wheel because he realized that was exactly what had been bothering him since the hallway inside the mall. But he pushed the thought aside and started the engine anyway, not knowing that at that exact moment someone several miles away had already received the call the man said he made and was now asking a single question that would change everything. Where is Sergeant Marcus Hale right now? The patrol vehicle had barely cleared the mall parking lot when Officer Daniel Reeves noticed something else that did not fit the story he believed he was in control of, because the man seated quietly behind him did not look around the way most people did when they were being transported downtown for questioning. He did not lean forward to ask what would happen next, and he did not protest or demand a lawyer or even ask where they were going. Instead, he simply watched the road ahead through the front windshield reflection with a calm focus that made the inside of the vehicle feel strangely quiet, even with the radio still humming softly between dispatch updates. And after several blocks passed in silence, Reeves finally spoke, without turning his head, saying, "You are going to have a chance to explain everything at the station, so if there is something you want to say, now would be the time." But the man answered in the same steady voice he had used since the hallway inside the mall, saying, "I already explained what mattered." And something about that sentence made Reeves tighten his grip slightly on the steering wheel, because it sounded less like uncertainty and more like confidence. Not the confidence of someone hoping to avoid trouble, but the confidence of someone who understood exactly how situations like this unfolded step by step long before they reached their destination. And as the patrol vehicle moved through late afternoon traffic, the dispatcher's voice returned over the radio again, this time asking for clarification about the identity of the civilian witness several callers had described as the person who directed evacuation movement inside the building before emergency responders arrived. And Reeves answered that identification would be confirmed at the station, even though the phrasing civilian witness sounded less certain than it had only minutes earlier. And behind him, the man finally shifted slightly in his seat, not with discomfort, but with purpose, as if recognizing that something outside the vehicle was already changing faster than anyone inside realized. And after another mile passed, he spoke again, quietly, saying the people inside the mall were moved to safer positions within 90 seconds because that was the safest window available. And Reeves glanced at the rearview mirror immediately, because that statement was too specific to ignore and too precise to belong to someone guessing under pressure. But before he could respond, the radio interrupted again with a different tone, this time not routine dispatch traffic, but a direct request from a supervisor asking Reeves to confirm whether the individual in custody had made any statements regarding prior training or affiliation. And the question surprised him enough that he hesitated before answering, "No affiliation confirmed." Yet even though he realized as soon as he said it that the request itself meant someone else was already asking questions he had not expected to answer today. And in the rearview mirror, he saw the man's eyes briefly meet his reflection for the first time since leaving the mall, and there was no tension there, and no fear, only the same quiet patience that had followed him from the hallway to the parking lot, and now into the moving vehicle, as if he were waiting for something very specific to arrive before he explained anything further. And as they approached the next intersection, Reeves noticed two black sport utility vehicles parked near the entrance of the station several blocks ahead, vehicles that did not belong to local patrol units and did not carry markings he recognized from routine department traffic. And he slowed slightly without realizing it, because something about their presence did not match the normal rhythm of an afternoon shift. And before he could decide whether the vehicles were connected to the situation at all, the man behind him spoke again in that same calm voice, saying, "They are already here sooner than I expected." And Reeves felt a sudden shift in the air inside the patrol vehicle, because he understood immediately that the sentence had not been a guess and had not been a coincidence, but a statement of certainty that meant whatever was waiting outside the station doors was not there for him. Officer Daniel Reeves slowed the patrol vehicle as they turned into the station parking lot, because the two black sport utility vehicles he had noticed from the intersection were still there, waiting exactly where the man in the back seat had said they would be, parked near the front entrance in a position that was too deliberate to belong to visitors and too unfamiliar to belong to anyone from his department. And as he pulled closer, he saw that neither vehicle carried visible department markings, yet both were positioned with quiet confidence, as if their drivers already knew exactly who they were there to meet. And something inside Reeves shifted in a way he could not explain, because situations like this did not normally begin with unidentified vehicles arriving before a report was even finished. But before he could say anything, the man seated behind him spoke again, calmly, saying they move fast when timing matters. And that sentence made Reeves glance into the rearview mirror with more attention than before, because it sounded less like observation and more like confirmation. And as the patrol vehicle rolled to a stop near the entrance, the station doors opened almost immediately, as if someone inside had been watching their arrival the entire time. And two men stepped outside without hesitation, dressed in plain dark jackets with no visible badges, yet carrying the unmistakable posture of people who did not wait for introductions before taking control of a situation. And what made Reeves pause was not their clothing or their presence, but the way the desk sergeant inside the station suddenly straightened his posture the moment he saw them approach, as if recognizing something important without saying a word. And before Reeves could open his door, one of the men reached the side of the patrol vehicle and looked directly through the window toward the back seat with calm certainty before speaking the name Sergeant Marcus Hale, as if confirming a detail that had never been in question at all. And the moment that name was spoken, Reeves felt the story he believed he understood begin shifting beneath his feet, because the man he had transported without hesitation now had a rank attached to him that had never appeared in any local report or dispatch message. And for the first time since leaving the mall, Reeves opened his door more slowly than before as the second man stepped closer and spoke again, saying, "We will take it from here." Not loudly and not aggressively, but with the kind of authority that did not require explanation. And the desk sergeant, who had been standing near the entrance, moved aside without being asked, as if recognizing exactly what kind of situation had just arrived at the front steps of the station. And Reeves turned toward the back seat with a question forming that he had not expected to ask earlier that afternoon. But before he could speak, the man behind him finally met his eyes directly for the first time since they had left the mall, and said quietly, "I told you someone needed to know what happened today." And as Reeves reached for the rear door handle, he noticed that both of the plainclothes men were already standing ready beside the vehicle, not waiting for permission and not waiting for explanation, because whatever authority they carried had arrived long before he understood why they were there. And as the rear door opened and Marcus Hale stepped out onto the pavement, the two men nodded once in acknowledgement rather than surprise, as if they had expected him to remain exactly as calm as he had been from the beginning. And Reeves realized at that moment that the situation he believed was routine had already moved far beyond his control long before he even reached the station parking lot. The moment Sergeant Marcus Hale stepped out of the patrol vehicle, the entire atmosphere outside the station shifted in a way Officer Daniel Reeves had never experienced before during a routine transfer, because the two plainclothes men did not approach him with questions and did not introduce themselves with casual conversation, but instead positioned themselves beside Marcus with the quiet certainty of people who had already verified everything they needed to know long before arriving. And one of them reached calmly toward Marcus's wrists without hesitation, as if removing the restraints was simply the next expected step, rather than something that required permission from anyone present. And Reeves instinctively stepped forward, saying, "Hold on a second, this is still an active situation under local jurisdiction." But the man closest to Marcus answered without raising his voice, saying, "Not anymore, it is not." And that sentence landed with a weight Reeves did not fully understand yet, because it carried the tone of authority that did not come from confidence alone, but from clearance. And inside the station lobby, several officers who had been moving normally only seconds earlier suddenly slowed their steps and began watching the scene unfold with quiet attention, as if recognizing something important without being told what it was. And the desk sergeant, who had earlier stepped aside, now stood completely still near the doorway, waiting rather than intervening, as if he understood that whatever was happening outside had already moved beyond standard procedure. And Marcus remained calm throughout the exchange, not speaking and not reacting as the restraint was removed from his wrist, with the same steady composure he had carried since the hallway inside the mall, as though the entire sequence had followed an expected timeline. he had been watching unfold rather than experiencing for the first time. And the second plainclothes man finally turned toward Reeves and said, "We need to confirm the timeline of contact inside the mall corridor immediately, because the individual involved in the earlier situation was not an ordinary suspect." And that clarification alone caused Reeves to pause, because the phrasing "individual" involved suggested a larger situation still unfolding beyond what he had been told over the radio earlier that afternoon. And before Reeves could respond, the first man continued speaking, this time more directly, saying Sergeant Hale responded within the safest available window before uniformed arrival, which prevented further escalation. Inside a civilian environment, and hearing the word sergeant again attached to Marcus's name made several officers inside the lobby exchange quick glances, because none of them remembered hearing that rank mentioned in any earlier report connected to the incident at the mall. And Reeves looked from Marcus to the two men, and then toward the station entrance behind him, as if expecting someone from his own command staff to step forward and clarify what was happening, but no one moved, because the presence of the two unmarked vehicles outside and the calm certainty of the men standing beside Marcus had already changed the balance of the situation before anyone inside realized it had shifted at all. And as Marcus finally spoke again, his voice remained quiet, but unmistakably clear, saying, "I requested notification as soon as confirmation reached command level, and they responded faster than expected," which explained why they were already standing there now instead of waiting hours for paperwork to catch up with reality. And Reeves felt a sudden realization begin forming in his mind, because if command level had already been notified before he even reached the station, then the call Marcus mentioned earlier had not been a request for help, but a report to someone who already knew exactly who he was. And just as that understanding began settling into place, one of the plainclothes men reached into his jacket and produced a credential that he held only long enough for the desk sergeant to see before returning it to its place without explanation, and the desk sergeant straightened immediately before speaking for the first time since the vehicles arrived, saying, "Officer Reeves, we are going to need a full report on everything that happened from first contact forward, because this situation is now being reviewed at a higher level than local procedure." And hearing that sentence, Reeves finally understood that the arrest he believed would close the incident had instead opened something much larger than he had expected. The moment he placed the cuffs on Marcus Hale inside the mall corridor earlier that afternoon, the lobby inside the station had never felt this quiet during an ordinary shift, and Officer Daniel Reeves could sense the change the moment the desk sergeant finished speaking, because conversations that normally continued in the background had stopped without anyone being told to stop them, and officers who had been walking through the hallway only minutes earlier were now standing still, pretending to review paperwork while watching what was unfolding near the entrance. And the two plainclothes men remained beside Sergeant Marcus Hale with the same steady posture they had carried since stepping out of the black vehicles, as if they were not visitors at all, but part of a structure that had already taken control of the situation before anyone inside the building realized it had shifted. And Reeves finally spoke again, asking what higher-level review meant, because the phrase did not belong to normal follow-up after a mall evacuation incident. But one of the men answered calmly, saying it means the timeline at the mall was not random, and the individual Sergeant Hale responded to was not an isolated threat the way it first appeared over public dispatch traffic. And hearing that explanation caused several officers standing nearby to exchange looks, because the wording suggested something larger had been happening inside the building before the first patrol unit even arrived on scene. And Marcus remained quiet through the exchange until the second plainclothes man turned slightly toward him and asked, "Did anyone inside the corridor interfere with your response window before responders entered the structure?" And Marcus answered simply, "No, the evacuation path remained stable once movement began," which again sounded less like a civilian explanation and more like a professional after-action confirmation that followed a structure most people in the room had never heard used outside training environments. And Reeves felt a tightening sensation in his chest as he realized that every sentence Marcus spoke sounded like part of a report already expected somewhere beyond the walls of the station rather than something being explained for the first time. And before he could respond, the desk sergeant received a call through the internal line behind the counter and straightened immediately while listening before nodding once and placing the receiver down carefully, as if the conversation had carried instructions rather than questions. And when he looked back toward Reeves, his voice was more formal than before as he said, "Command just confirmed the identity attached to Sergeant Hale's clearance level, and they are requesting that all contact details from the mall corridor be documented exactly as they occurred from first interaction forward without delay." And that sentence landed heavily in the lobby because clearance level was not a phrase normally used during routine witness processing, and certainly not attached to someone who had arrived in the back seat of a patrol vehicle only minutes earlier. And Reeves looked toward Marcus again, searching for some reaction that would make sense of what was happening, but Marcus simply stood with the same calm focus he had carried since the beginning, as if the confirmation had arrived exactly when he expected it to arrive rather than earlier or later. And one of the plainclothes men finally spoke again, this time more directly to Reeves, saying the individual inside the mall corridor was already being tracked under a federal watch status before entry into the building, which means Sergeant Hale's response prevented a situation that would have unfolded very differently if the timing had shifted even slightly. And hearing that explanation made the room feel smaller for a moment, because it meant the incident everyone believed had ended inside the mall hallway was actually connected to something still unfolding beyond local jurisdiction. And as Reeves absorbed the meaning of that sentence, he realized that the quiet man he had transported without hesitation earlier that afternoon had not been reacting to events the way everyone else inside the building had been reacting, but had instead been acting according to information and training that belonged to a world far beyond the patrol reports he expected to finish before the end of his shift. Officer Daniel Reeves stood in the station lobby longer than he realized because the explanation he had just heard did not match anything he expected when he first stepped into Rivergate Mall earlier that afternoon, responding to what he believed was a routine emergency call. And now the phrase federal watch status continued echoing in his mind with a weight that made the earlier arrest feel less like procedure and more like a mistake he could not yet fully measure. And before he could decide what to say next, one of the plainclothes men stepped closer to the front counter where the desk sergeant had already cleared space, as if anticipating exactly what was about to happen, and quietly placed a folder on the surface that had not been there moments earlier. And although the folder remained closed, its presence alone changed the tone inside the room, because everyone watching understood that information had arrived before any official request from the local department had even been written. And the man opened the folder only slightly long enough for the desk sergeant to confirm a seal printed across the top corner before closing it again with deliberate care, as if the contents were not meant for general circulation inside the building. And then he turned back toward Reeves and spoke in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning, saying the individual encountered inside the mall corridor was not acting independently, and Sergeant Hale recognized indicators connected to an existing monitoring operation before uniformed response entered the structure, which is why evacuation movement began earlier than expected. And hearing that explanation made several officers nearby exchange looks again, because the idea that someone inside a crowded shopping mall had been identified as part of an existing monitoring operation meant the situation had never truly belonged to local jurisdiction at all. And Reeves felt the realization settle slowly as he remembered the precise wording Marcus had used inside the hallway when he first spoke. The situation was contained, and understood now that those words had not been reassurance for the crowd, but confirmation for someone who already knew what they meant. And as that understanding formed, the second plainclothes man stepped forward and addressed the desk sergeant directly, saying command-level confirmation has already been logged and coordination with Federal Review is active, which means Officer Reeves will need to provide a complete contact timeline, including verbal interaction before transport began. And the desk sergeant nodded immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if he had expected the request before the sentence was finished. And Reeves finally asked the question that had been building since the moment the two vehicles appeared outside the station, asking what kind of monitoring operation required that level of response before anyone even finished filing an incident report. And the answer came without hesitation from the first plainclothes man, who said the kind where response timing determines whether a situation remains contained inside one building or spreads beyond it. And the simplicity of that sentence made the entire lobby feel smaller, because it suggested that what happened inside the mall corridor earlier that afternoon had been closer to the edge of something larger than anyone present had realized at the time. And Marcus finally spoke again, quietly but clearly, saying the window closed exactly when it needed to, which confirmed what the two men already seemed to know before they arrived. And as Reeves listened, he began to understand that the call Marcus had mentioned earlier had not been a request for assistance and had not been a warning, but a report confirming that the timeline inside the mall had followed expectations closely enough for someone outside the city to respond immediately. And just as that realization settled into place, the desk sergeant's phone rang. Again, and this time, when he answered, his posture changed even more noticeably before he looked back toward Reeves and said, "Command staff just confirmed that the situation at the mall is now being reviewed jointly with federal oversight, which means your initial arrest decision is part of a timeline that will be examined in full detail beginning right now." Officer Daniel Reeves did not move for several seconds after the desk sergeant finished speaking, because the meaning of the words federal oversight review carried a weight he had never expected to hear attached to an arrest he believed had been routine only an hour earlier. And the silence that followed inside the station lobby was not confusion anymore, but recognition spreading slowly across the faces of the officers nearby as they realized the situation unfolding in front of them was no longer about a misunderstanding at a shopping mall, but about decisions that had already been logged somewhere far beyond their building. And as Reeves looked towards Sergeant Marcus Hale again, he noticed something he had missed earlier: not fear, not frustration, not even relief, but the same steady patience Marcus had carried since the hallway inside the mall, as if this moment had always been part of a timeline he understood from the beginning. And one of the plainclothes men stepped forward again and spoke quietly, but clearly, saying, "Command level confirmation has now verified that Sergeant Hale responded within authorized engagement awareness parameters connected to an ongoing monitoring framework, which means his actions inside the mall protected civilians before local units reached visual contact with the situation." And hearing those words spoken out loud changed something inside the room, because for the first time the entire sequence that began in the corridor started making sense to everyone except the one person who had believed he was controlling it. And Reeves finally asked the question he had been avoiding since the black vehicles arrived outside the station, asking what happens now when a response like that is misunderstood in the field. And the answer came without hesitation from the second plainclothes man, who said, "When a response like that is misunderstood, the review does not stop at paperwork. It continues until responsibility is clearly established." And the desk sergeant confirmed immediately that internal affairs had already been notified through command channels before Reeves even completed his first transport report, which meant the timeline of the arrest decision itself had already entered formal review. And as those words settled into place, Marcus finally spoke again, not loudly and not with anger, but with the calm clarity he had shown from the beginning, saying, "The only reason I stepped forward inside that corridor was because people needed time to move safely, and time is something you cannot recover once it is lost." And several officers nearby lowered their eyes slightly, because the sentence carried more truth than explanation. And the first plainclothes man then added that the monitoring operation connected to the earlier situation had already been confirmed at the federal level, which meant Sergeant Hale's presence inside the building was not coincidence, but part of a readiness posture maintained for exactly the kind of moment that had unfolded earlier that afternoon. And Reeves felt the full weight of that realization settle as he understood that the calm man he had placed in the back seat of his patrol vehicle had never been a suspect, and had never been uncertain, and had never been waiting for permission from anyone inside the building, because his role in that corridor had begun long before the first emergency call reached local dispatch. And as the station doors opened again and a command staff vehicle arrived outside the entrance, the desk sergeant spoke once more in a formal tone, saying, "Officer Reeves, you will be contacted directly regarding the review timeline connected to your arrest decision earlier today." And in that moment, Reeves finally understood that what began as a single choice in a crowded hallway had already become part of a record that would follow him long after the noise from the mall had faded. And Marcus Hale simply nodded once toward the officers standing nearby, before turning toward the two men who had arrived for him earlier, because the responsibility he carried that afternoon had never been about recognition and had never been about explanation, but about making sure the right people reached safety before anyone else even realized how close they had come to losing it.